Well, good morning, and welcome to what I think is the fifth in the joint CGD EOL seminar series.
Whatever you think.
No, we had three at least up there and two here. This year, the second here. And as far as I know, this is the last that's scheduled, but if anyone has ideas for giving CGD seminars for this, I think we'd love to have this seminar series continue. So let me or Brian, I guess, know who's the new CG seminar coordinator. I should also announce that a week from today, there will be Dave Emmett from Simpson Weather that'll give us a talk about a new wind LiDAR. So it's our pleasure to welcome Rosie Fisher. She got her undergraduate degree in biology from Oxford, went on to get a PhD in Edinburgh doing a rain exclusion experiment in the Amazon. So she is an observationalist. And went on to do a postdoc at Sheffield University in the UK and another postdoc at Los Alamos. And in 2010 started as a scientist here with CGD Terrestrial Science section. So, Rosie, you ready?
Okay. So I was going to turn the lights down. There we go, that's better. And get the where's the bendy stick? There it is. Right, bendy stick. Okay. So thank you all for coming. I've sort of aimed this seminar quite at a sort of a general audience, so hopefully that'll gel with the makeup here. Today I'm going to talk about the work that I've been doing in terrestrial sciences, developing this new version of the community land model, and that's going to be sort of the first section of the talk. And then after that, I'm going to talk about ways that we use Earth observation data for testing and benchmarking our model simulations and some of the new results we're getting from the new model. First of all, I put this this figure up because it doesn't have any part to play in the science that I'm going to show you, but I think it's very captivating. This is the 1 kilometer global canopy height product from NASA from the ICESat campaign, and I think I find it quite beautiful, and I think it's very compelling that these all over the planet you see these ribbons of forest, the red ribbons here, in these quite small geographical areas, and I kind of feel like this acts as a kind of imperative for us to understand whether these little ribbons, which they can kind of seem quite delicate in some places, will they be resilient in the face of climate change? Is a kind of a key motivating question of this kind of research. And another motivating aspect of this research is our basically profound ignorance of what will happen to the carbon cycle feedback over the next 100 years. So this is a figure which is shown at the beginning of every single talk on land surface science that is ever given. And this is from Pierre Friedlingstein's work. This is his 2014 paper from the CMIP-5 assessment of climate change models. CMIP-6. And what this shows is on this side, this is the annual carbon exchange between the land and the atmosphere, and this is the cumulative version of this data. And so what you can see is that between 1860 and 2100, we have this huge spread in the carbon which goes either in or out of the land surface. And by 2100, our what you might call our uncertainty in this component is like 16 petagrams of carbon, and that's more than the annual anthropogenic emissions at the present time. Another thing to note is that these two blue lines, they're the NCAR Earth system model, or the NORI-SM, which is more or less the same. Both have the same land surface. And what that's saying is that our model is the most pessimistic version of the land surface in this ensemble. So the reason for that, we know why that is because this model has a representation of the nitrogen cycle, which means that plants are limited in how much they can respond to fertilization by CO2. But nevertheless, you shouldn't really take this as an example, as a metric of uncertainty, because these are just a handful of manifestations of a whole universe of possible models. But what we can take from it is that the magnitudes of future carbon exchange are possibly very large and apparently still unconstrained. We haven't done, since the last assessment, we haven't done a very good job of narrowing this uncertainty bound. So narrowing the uncertainty bound is what we do in the terrestrial sciences section all the time, and we do it with this tool, which is the CLM, the community land model. And the community land model is probably the most comprehensive representation of the land surface in any of the Earth system models that are currently out there. And this is Dave Lawrence. Dave's the chair of the Land Model Working Group. This is his representation of all the processes that exist in the CLM. So we've got the biogeophysics, surface energy fluxes here, and we've got the hydrology component, the biogeochemical cycles, how carbon and nitrogen interact to make plants. And then at the landscape scale, we have things like the river routing model, and a representation of urban model in cities. We have glaciers, we have lakes, we have land use change, we have crops, we have vegetation, competition, we have interactions with the atmosphere. It's like a phenomenally complex piece of machinery. So what I'm going to talk about today is something a little bit more fundamental, which is the nature of how we abstract the land surface into our model. I'm specifically going to talk about the vegetated land surface. So this is the part that isn't lakes or glaciers or soil or whatever. So the part which has vegetation on. And what Earth system modelers typically do is they divide up the diversity of plant life, divide into a number of what we call plant functional types. So these are plant types that behave the same in general. And they very coarsely represent plant diversity in the way that maybe a child might draw. And so we have sort of needle-leaf trees, broadleaf trees, see-through grass, see-through grass, etc. And these are kind of arranged on the land surface in a way, in the current model, are arranged in a way which says that basically they're kind of antisocial. So all the needle-leaf trees all live in one part of the grid cell, and all the grass lives in another part of the grid cell, and the broadleaf trees live in another part of the grid cell. They don't talk to each other, they just kind of exist on their own. And so this representation has some pros and cons. So one downside is that we're representing basically one average plant per tile. So we kind of pretend that all the needle-leaf trees are all the same. So that all the needle-leaf trees might be 10 metres, all the broadleaf trees might be 15 metres, depending on the output of the model. And so there's no real representation of size, structure, or anything like that. And because they're not talking to each other really, there's no competition between, for example, a broadleaf tree and a C4 grass. There's no competition for light resources. C3 and C4 are just different kinds of grass. You don't know that. So the other thing is that if we're trying to predict how many needle-leaf trees and how many broadleaf trees there are, the area of them is basically proportional to the relative growth rate. So they just kind of like, if they're growing at different speeds, they might sort of elbow each other out by this sort of empirical method. It's not a mechanistic approach. But at the same time, because we only have one average plant per tile, this model is very, very computationally efficient, and it's critically it's deterministic, which is another thing that applies to all models. Because of this, this is the approach which is used in basically all Earth system model simulations. But as you can imagine, behind the scenes of what ecologists do to Earth system models, there is in fact a science of ecology, which is a large and venerable organisation, and the science of ecology is generally in uproar about our horrendous treatment of both diversity and plant competition. I think this is fair to say. Everywhere you go, someone complains about it to you. And in the recent years, probably in the last decade, there's been a big push from the community. These are all papers that do this. There's a big push to represent competition between plants in a more realistic way. Oh dear. So what does that mean? So what it means is that we have to try and more realistically represent how ecological systems organise the diversity of plant life. So ecology is very complex and difficult. It's difficult to sort of nail down specific processes because the world is so heterogeneous, etc. But one thing that we do know in ecology is that this happens. So this is a representation of the process of succession, right? And so what happens in succession is it's very intuitive. You have a forest ecosystem full of tall plants, and some disturbance happens. One of them dies, there's a fire, etc. Volcano erupts. And so we get bare ground, right? And on the bare ground, new plants colonise, new small plants colonise here. And as they grow, they enter a phase where they're all competing for resources. So they compete for light, water, and nutrients, space. And so in this phase here, we get this process of competition. And the outcome of competition is either that one thing wins and excludes everything else, or that things coexist, right? And of course, more generally, ecosystems have more than one plant, and so generally things coexist. And then we get to this sort of late successional, mature ecosystem stage, and we start again. So this is always going on. The landscape is a matrix of cells doing this process. So why does that matter? The reason it matters is because this part, this competition phase of the regrowth pathway, we're determining how diverse our ecosystem is, right? And a general feature of complex systems, not just ecological ones, economic ones, etc., is that enhanced functional diversity leads to greater resilience. So basically, the more different ways you have of making a living as a plant in your ecosystem, the less likely the ecosystem is to suffer a big collapse. So the more likely you are to have some things that are more resilient to stress than others. So how much resilience you have determines how large these mortality events are. So this part really matters for example, our response of the ecosystems to climate change. So if you want to simulate this part in the middle, this growth competition part, we basically have to have competition for light resources, because in a tall forest, what's mostly happening is that trees are trying to grow bigger than each other to get more light resources. And so modelling competition for light requires that we have different plants growing in the same vertical profile. And that is harder than it sounds. And the most intense mechanistic way you can simulate this process is by literally going to your computer and making a model which has all the trees in it. And so this is what we call individual-based modelling. And so this is a figure which is manifestation of the spatially explicit individual-based DGVM, which is from Jamstech. And so we have literally every tree has its own little spatial location and size, and they're kind of modelling the 3D light environment in this world, and so they're simulating competition like that. So this is great because we get this sort of brute force process-based representation of forests. The hard part about this is that each of these trees and each time step has to either die or not die, right? And so that's a stochastic process in most of these models. And because it's a stochastic process, that means we have to have ensemble simulations, right? Have to have ensemble simulations of all these trees, right? Which means it's computationally intensive and doesn't give deterministic output. And maybe one day we'll be able to sell a stochastic output to the rest of the CESM community, but probably not in the next year or so. So the reason that using this kind of model is good is because we have this more complex representation of the light environment. And this is a comparison of an individual-based model and the same model in the sort of area-based approach, which is where we have the trees not talking to each other. And you can see that as time goes on, in the area-based model, the tree, which is the horizontal stripes, I forget which one it is, it doesn't matter, ends up dominating the whole ecosystem. And in this individual-based model, we get a much more nuanced representation of coexistence of different plant types here. So that's good, that's what we want to happen. But, so it's in this quandary. So the kind of model we have now does this, basically, and the kind of model that we might want ideally is very expensive. So we've basically come to some kind of a solution which is a compromise, and the compromise is called the Ecosystem Demography model, which is called ED for short. And this was an idea introduced by Paul Moorcroft, George Hurt, and Steve Bacala when they were all working at Princeton in 2001. And so the idea of this is that instead of modelling each individual tree, we divide up the world into groups of trees, basically. So we do that in two ways. The first thing we do is we divide the landscape into successional age classes. So we divide it along this axis that I was showing you earlier. So we have some parts of the landscape that were just recently disturbed, some parts that are undergoing this competitive process, and some parts which are sort of at the end of that and sort of producing large gaps when they die. The other thing we do is that we divide the vegetation in each of these into different height and plant type classes. So we get trees of, rather than having one individual tree, which is 12 meters tall, we have some that are 6, some that are 11, some that are 20. We have a height distribution like that. So changing the CLM to work like this is what I have been doing for all of my adult life that I can remember. And it's exciting, just beginning to work, so that's cool. And we've decided that we're going to call our model we're going to call it the next generation biogeophysical and biogeochemical core for the CLM, which is rather bombastic, but so be it. We decided to use the word core because that's how the atmospheric and the ocean modelers describe the part of the model which is like the middle part of the model, so we just stole their language so that they would take us more seriously. Anyway, so in this new model, we, instead of having the tiling structure like it was before when I showed you, we have the landscape structure according to disturbance history. We have height resolved competition with different plants for light. And this is good because this means that our plant distribution, like how many broadleaf, needleleaf trees, etc., emerges from the plant functional properties. So we don't prescribe anything, we just have all these things as moving parts in the model. So if you change something about the leaf thickness of broadleaf trees, it can result in the boundary between broadleaf and needleleaf trees moving 100 kilometres, for example. So some model structure, for those of you that are interested in that kind of thing. Currently our CLM model looks like this. We have this hierarchy of objects, right? We start with a grid cell, a climatic grid cell. Everything in the grid cell has the same climate. And then we divide it into these land units, like I said, of soil, lake, ice, etc. And then we divide the soil land unit and the others into different columns. So we might have one column for crops and one column for natural vegetation, or something like that. And then within the natural vegetation column of soil, that's just a bunch of soil, we divide that into different areas. This is the existing model structure. We divide into these different tiles for all the different plant functional types like that. In the new model, we've added an extra layer of hierarchy. And because each of these structures no longer refers to one plant functional type, we've decided to call these patches. And in each patch, we have lots of different cohorts of trees, which might be different plant functional types existing within these different age structures. So this is maybe the early successional, mid-successional, late successional, young, middle-aged, old ecosystems. I just put that up just because that's the kind of the bulk of the work we've been doing is in disentangling everything from the assumptions that were made in the CLM in the first place and putting it back together like this. So we've added, because the model works in a very different way, because it's simulating individual sort of plant cohorts, and we have a different way of intercepting light, for example. Then we've had to redesign lots of the ecosystem physiology in the CLM to accommodate it changing to this. It's not just a direct swap between the first model and the second model. So one of the main things we've done is change the radiation scheme. So the radiation scheme is how the plants intercept light. The standard CLM method uses a closed form approximation for this, which is called the two-stream approximation, which is, I believe, common to the atmosphere model as well. But the two-stream approximation has lots of assumptions which didn't fit our new representation of the world. So our new representation of the world basically means we have to have different plant functional types living on top of each other. So how they do this is that this layer of green here, that's the canopy. So if you've been into a forest, you might have noticed that forests often split themselves into trees that are in the canopy and trees that are in plants in the understory. So we're trying to represent that process here. That's like a self-organizing process. So we have one canopy layer which has different plant functional types in parallel, and then underneath that the light streams mix together. This is the direct and diffuse light streams coming down from the sun. They mix together and then they fall onto the understory, and then again they fall onto the soil, and then the lights bounce back up the soil. Some of it goes back into the atmosphere, and then some of it bounces back down off the leaf surfaces again, back down into the soil, and so on and so on. And we keep doing this until we have convergence. And so this is one of the changes to the physiology we've had to make to allow this new representation of plant competition to happen. And because my focus of this seminar isn't strictly plant physiology, I've just listed all the different other changes we've made to avoid going into them in great depth. We've changed the canopy structure, the carbon partitioning of how plants allocate to leaves and storage and roots. We've added this leaf area optimization. I'll talk about that later. We've changed the tree death model so that it's based on the amount of sugar the plants have stored in them. We have crown aeroplasticity, so trees can change from when they grow in an open field, they spread their leaves out quite wide, and when they grow in a forest, they bunch them up. That's what that is. We changed the phenology scheme. That's when leaves come on and off because of cold and drought stress. We've added a new fire model, which can take advantage of the fact that we have a height-structured canopy. And I've added a seed model so that seeds can survive, plants can survive through fire events and other disasters. So what this means is that the CLM-Ed, which is the model that I'm going to talk about, is a very different land surface model to CLM 4.5. CLM 4.5 is the current manifestation, the released version of the CLM that we're working with. So how can we tell if it's fit for purpose? We use a large number of observational data in the terrestrial sciences section to figure out whether we're to keep us honest in terms of our predictions of the future. This is obviously a very complex, it's an extraordinarily complex system, the CLM. We can't just be sort of picking numbers out of a hat and hoping that everything will work fine, because it won't. So the three kinds of data we use typically are ground-based observation campaigns. This is just where people go out and measure the world. Say they measure plant productivity of ecosystems, they measure nutrient dynamics, how much nitrogen is in the soil, in the leaves, and the wood. They measure plant water use with little things that you plug into trees and talk to them. And so that's our first sort of data. Second sort of data is ecosystem manipulation experiments. Like Steve was saying, I worked on a drying experiment in the tropics for my PhD, but there are also CO2 fertilization experiments, heating experiments, fire experiments. These tend to be very expensive, big things, right? So they're big in scale. They're typically like tens to hundreds of meters in spatial scale, because we worry that small experiments don't tell us enough about the scaling properties of the system. Third kind of data we use, which I'll talk about mostly, is Earth observation products. What can we see from space about ecosystems? And of course, because this is a CGD EOL seminar, I'm not going to talk about any of the other data apart from the EO product. So the main thing that we've been able to see from space for quite a while is normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI. And this is NDVI, goes from 0 to 1. And it's an index of how much photosynthetic pigment exists in any given place. And the reason it works is because plant pigments, these things, chlorophyll, carotenoids, etc., mostly absorb radiation between 400 and 700 nanometers, right? And because they don't like to be too hot, plants also reflect radiation in the near-infrared, shorter wavelengths. They reflect that very effectively. So the ratio of how much near-infrared to visible is reflected or absorbed tells you, to some relatively good approximation, how much pigment activity exists in that forest or that ecosystem. So that's cool, because as you can see, this is fairly obvious. This is showing us where the plants are on planet Earth, right? But for models, it's not actually super useful, because we don't know about what NDVI is as a metric for how green things are. It doesn't really tell us very much about ecosystems. What we really care about in the CLM 4.5 is something called leaf area index. So leaf area index is how we scale our carbon fluxes. We need to know how many leaves there are in the ecosystem before we can tell you anything about productivity, evaporation, that kind of thing. So for those of you that don't know what leaf area index is, this is what it is. So if you imagine a forest, and you imagine for a minute that you were hovering over the forest with this stick, and you dropped it down, and you would want to know how many leaves the stick intercepted as it went down. On average, of course, it's very heterogeneous, right? So if I drop the stick here, I hit 2 leaves. If I drop them here, I hit 2 leaves. If I drop it here, I hit 3. Here, I hit 5. Here, I hit 4. LAI is the average of those numbers. So because this is a very important property in our models, it's basically our metric of how much gas exchange and productivity is happening. We try hard to measure it. The best way to measure LAI, the best, most accurate way, because it's a complex property, it's not super easy to measure, right? So the best way is to destroy a plant, pull all its leaves off, lay them out on a piece of paper, take 70,000 pictures of them with your 2001 era digital camera, which is extremely tedious, but you get an actual estimate of what LAI should be. These are pictures from my experiment. I have many of them. If anyone is interested, I've always wanted to make some kind of installation art out of this set of pictures, but I haven't quite got there. Anyway, so if you don't want to do that, you can use this thing, which is called an LAI 2000, which I haven't written anywhere on this slide. But an LAI 2000 is what this person is using out in their forest. And what it does is it basically takes a hemispherical photograph of the leaf canopy and figures out, and you take another one in a sort of open place with no trees, so you're just looking at the sky directly. And the delta between those two, it makes some assumptions about how the leaves are arranged in space, and it tells you what the leaf area index should be according to an inversion of the model that it has internally of how leaves intercept light. So this is data on leaf area index from our drought experiment in Brazil, so you can see that it went along being 5, and then the drought experiment happened, and that's this line here, the leaf area index went down. Because we sort of messed with the forest a bit, the leaf area index and the control went down as well, but then they diverged. So we get this difference in leaf area index between the two. So that's what you do on the ground, but of course we can't have LAI measurements everywhere, because LAI 2000s are quite expensive, and, well, actually, some people are like making iPhones that do this now, right? So we might be able to have LAI measurements everywhere, but I digress. Mostly we want to use Earth observation measurements of LAI. So how we do that is we basically do the same thing that the LAI 2000 was doing. We invert a canopy model. So we go from our satellite reflectance NDVI, and then we make a sort of hypothetical model where the unknown part is how many leaves there are. The known part is this reflectance ratio here, and we sort of invert that to say, well, how many leaves do we think there are? And the results of this inversion look a bit like this. So it's very non-linear. So at this part where NDVI is high, the change in LAI is very, very steep. So at some point it becomes very difficult to know what the maximum LAI is. But basically, this product, this is the MODIS leaf area index product, is a inversion of a kind of like the radiation transfer model I showed you before. It's an inversion of that to get to here. So I shouldn't introduce this without saying that this is a hornet's nest of observation-operated confusion. The model that we have makes one set of assumptions about how leaves are arranged in space, like I showed you. Mine has an assumption about how the plants are mixed together, etc. The model that NASA used has a different set of assumptions, right? And for some reason, knowing those assumptions seems to be an impossible thing in land surface science. I've never understood why that is, but it always seems very difficult to make this work. Nevertheless, people have been using this kind of data for quite a long time. So in the past, everyone's favourite ecologist turned astronaut, Piers Sellers, who's a poster child for being a land surface modeler and then becoming an astronaut. That's why we all do it. Anyway, so you too could be an astronaut. So in version 1 of the CLM, which Piers Sellers had lots to do with, basically used a lookup table of vegetation class. We said if we're a forest, our LAI is like 5, if we're a grassland is 3, to tell you what leaf area was. But that was obviously not very good. So in 1994, version 2 of the CLM, which was at that point called SIB, integrated this LAI product from the early AVHRR satellite just to introduce leaf area index into the model. Leaf area index was basically an input to the model at that point in time, and now it's a prognostic part of the model. So now leaf area index is a moving part of the land surface model. So we try and predict it theory, and we try and predict it from theory, and we use the observations to see if our theory is good or bad, basically. So the theory that exists in the CLM at the moment is basically what I'm called the mass balance method. And I've illustrated this with these two dripping taps. So the dripping tap is productivity, so it's how much productivity you have times the fraction that goes into leaf biomass. And this is a high productivity, low productivity. And down the bottom we have this thing called turnover rate. So the turnover rate's sort of a constant fraction. And so if we have a high productivity, then we've got a high leaf area, low productivity, low leaf area. It's basically just a sort of dumb sort of bath system like that. And so the reason, historically, in the recent past, the CLM family of models, CLM4, 4.5, the two versions of that, have this really strong high LAI bias. And so these are the MODIS observations, the maximum LAI, and this is the model output from CLM 4.5. And so the scale goes up to 11, and you can see the observations rarely pass about 6.5, right? Whereas the CLM, at least at this resolution, produces results up to 11. We've had higher ones depending on how we're driving the model. And the reason for this, there's no physiologically realistic limit applied to the leaf mass. And so I tried to fix that in the CLM-Ed by introducing this hypothesis. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to, just as an aside, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different hypotheses that I've added into the model that can be tested using our Earth observation products. And so this hypothesis is called leaf area optimization. And so the idea of optimization is that you treat the plant almost like you decide that evolution should push plant physiology to a state where it's doing more or less the right thing according to some sort of optimality metric, right? So you say, if I were a plant, how many leaves would I make in order to produce the maximum amount of carbon out of my canopy? And one thing I probably wouldn't do is have leaves that cost more to make than they pay me back in photosynthesis. That would probably be sort of logically a stupid thing to do, right? So my hypothesis is that plants do this, right? And so this is the benefit of having leaves down through the canopy, and this is the cost of making them, right? So in this model, they're all the same cost. And at some point, these lines intersect, and where they intersect, we figure that out, and then leaves in negative carbon balance are removed by gradually reducing the allocation to leaf area. So we should in theory sort of end up with an LAI around here. And so when we introduce this into the model, this is the CLM-Ed without the optimization. So we are producing overestimates before we add in this theory. And this is the CLM-Ed with the optimization model. So you can see that we've basically eradicated this problem that the CLM's had for a while. And this problem of high LAI is troubling because LAI drives so many processes in the model. It drives photosynthesis and evaporation, etc. And so we've eradicated this high LAI problem here in the sort of optimized version of the CLM-Ed. And I should say at this point, I'm going to dwell on this too much. So this version of the model is like the first set of global runs that we've done with the sort of new version of the CLM. And because we're sort of just starting off, I wanted to sort of simplify the world as much as possible. So this just has one kind of plant. This just has plants that are trees, and they're evergreen, and they're broadleaf. So that's what happens when you add in one plant functional type to the model. So this is without having a huge number of degrees of freedom in terms of adding different plants and calibrating their parameters. So just to follow up on that, this is the degree to which leaf area index is constrained by the optimization. So in these parts, we're getting 0.4 of the maximum number of leaves that we wanted to have. And here, where the productivity is low, the canopy depth doesn't really ever get so big that the model is triggered. So that's kind of interesting. Anyway, the next sort of data I'm going to talk about is gross photosynthetic productivity. So this is how much carbon is assimilated from the atmosphere by the plants before we've accounted for anything else, before we've accounted for respiration or leaf growth or anything. It's just how much carbon is going into the photosynthetic machinery. And this is actually something that's quite hard to measure from space, right? The best way we have of measuring photosynthesis is with these things called flux towers, eddy covariance flux towers. And this is a depiction of how an eddy covariance flux tower works. What it has is it has two things. It has this thing, which is a sonic anemometer, which measures the direction of the wind at very high temporal resolution. So we're literally measuring all these little parcels of air, sort of buffeting past the sensor up and down, sideways, whatever. And then put next to the sensor we have a gas analyzer, which sucks the air in from those parcels and says, it's basically asks the question, on average, does the air going up contain more carbon dioxide than the air going down past this sensor? And that gives you this kind of data here. This is some flux tower in England, and we so basically during the winter, the ecosystem gives out carbon, and the atmospheric centric convention is that giving out carbon is negative, right? So giving out carbon here, and then we're taking in carbon here, right? So we get all these oscillations we can observe, and there are lots of flux towers in the world. One of them is at Niwot Ridge in Colorado, which some of you might have been to. There's one in Brazil where I work. There's one in Germany. There's, in fact, lots and lots. This is the map of the FluxNet project, which is a project to make all these people do the same thing. So we standardize the flux tower measurements and the equipment and the methodology for calculating fluxes, etc. And so because this is approaching global coverage, if you might say if you were feeling generous, this is approaching global coverage in terms of climate type anyway. What we do to make this into a global product, and I say we, I mean the group in the Max Planck Institute in Jena do this mostly, and they use a statistical model tree estimation where they input a bunch of climate variables, they input the retrieved Canopy greenness index, they input vegetation type from another EO product. And so they give us outputs of gross primary productivity and evapotranspiration, which we can use as some kind of benchmark for our models. So we end up with and this is how well it does, modeled ET versus measured ET. So we end up with a global product which is here, of global photosynthetic fluxes, sort of across many years of integration. So before I talk about CLM-Ed, I should mention that this product was used recently by Gordon to improve the CLM-4 gross photosynthetic productivity, which, as you can see, also suffered from a very high bias in the tropics. Before there was a couple of alterations made to the radiation deception scheme and how photosynthesis was parameterized, and so those things made the CLM 4.5, which is these fluxes here, much closer to the observations than they had been before. So we've already used this product to help constrain our model. Further to that, this is the GPP that the CLM-Ed is currently producing. So we have in these figures, we have the CLM 4.5 here, we have the FluxNet product here, and we have the CLM-Ed here. So you can see, I mean, the differences between these are now relatively subtle compared to the ones we had before. So we can see that we have, so I guess it's the same order of magnitude of mismatch between this model and this one, but they're just different kinds of mismatch. So the CLM-Ed performs much better in savannas. If you look at this gradient here compared to the savanna problem, which we have in CLM 4.5 here, similarly in Brazil. We have an overestimation up here of GPP. That's partly because I only have evergreen trees, right? It turns out if you can add in deciduous trees to the model, but they just take over the whole northern hemisphere. And so I'm still working on how to get those things to coexist. That's probably the next talk that I'll give. I'm kind of leaving this here now. I'm not going to introduce a new hypothesis into the GPP model, because it seems like our new radiation deception scheme isn't behaving in a way which is terrible compared to the existing model. And instead, I'm going to look at the evapotranspiration product, which is produced in the same way from flux towers. And so what we find there is that this is the same. This is the CLM-4.5. This is the Flux net product, and this is CLM-Ed. What I find here is that the 4.5 is producing a slight overestimate compared to the satellite product. And the CLM-Ed is producing an even greater transpiration. So this is curious to me why this should happen. And so I picked a point in Brazil there, and I did a sensitivity analysis to see if this was a parametric problem in the model. Right? So I did 100 simulations at that place in Brazil, and I perturbed some parameters that I thought would be influential on the evapotranspiration. So I perturbed the photosynthetic capacity. This is the water use efficiency. This is the drought tolerance of the plants. These are 3 other ones which didn't have any effect. Except it turned out that this was an extremely boring sensitivity analysis because only this parameter had any effect at all on the photosynthetic fluxes. And this parameter, this photosynthetic capacity, is a very strong control over ecosystem gas exchange. So this isn't very surprising. What is a bit surprising is that we still don't get down to the right numbers. So in this, you see here, which we're sort of shooting for like around 100. And irrespective of, this is the lowest VC max you would probably want to have. And so we're still not getting down to that level. We only have a sensitivity of about 5. And so this kind of made me to think, well, is there a structural bias in our transpiration model? And I presented this at the CESM meeting last week. And afterwards, Sean Swenson came up to me and told me that he had discovered that there was a bias in the drivers, the offline meteorological drivers we were using for the CLM. So I think this problem is due to the low humidity in the driver files that we're using. And he'd done some analyses where he showed that was the case. So I was going to do this model runs, but I couldn't get it to run on the same machine where that new data resides that he was using. So anyway, we have some hope for that. So the 4th kind of data I'm going to talk about is on Canopy biomass. So biomass is a very recent thing that we can use to assess our vegetation models. This is a paper from a couple of months ago, from the Jena group in Germany. And this is a product for Northern Hemisphere biomass. And it's so new that I haven't got the data yet. So this is just the figure from the paper. And what they're using the synthetic aperture radar on the NVSat mission to estimate something called growing stock volume. So this is basically the volume of the forest that the satellite can see. And then they've used a bunch of ground data to calibrate what that satellite sees against forest biomass in kilograms of carbon per meter squared, right? So these 2 plots are interesting because this one's showing the actual carbon, the actual forest carbon the satellite sees, right? And this one is showing the carbon density of forest ecosystems in each pixel. So it's basically accounting, to some extent, for land use change, right? So you'll see that Europe has hardly any forest biomass in real life, but if it was all covered in forest, then this would be its carbon density. So this product is actually much more useful for comparing to our vegetation model if we think our vegetation model is trying to predict the sort of natural state of the ecosystem, which it is at the moment. So, so these are the comparisons of the model. And so what we see is we're kind of getting roughly the right magnitudes of biomass. We're getting very slight overestimates in these more productive places. This is the new CLM-Ed model. The main criticism that I would throw at this set of simulations is that the tree line is too far north. If you look at this northern part, apologies for the difference in resolution. Like I said, I haven't actually got this data yet because the model only started running like about 2 weeks ago, so I haven't actually got the data yet. Anyway, so this, you look at up here, northern Scandinavia, we're getting the tree line right up by the Arctic Circle there. And also over here in Siberia, we've got these values of 4 and 5 happening up here, whereas they're more like 2 or 3 in the data product. So I thought to myself, well, why is that? Why are we getting the tree line too far north in the model? And the first possible explanation for this that came to mind was a basically a trend which has been happening, which is not a trend, a very prominent idea in the last 3 years in ecosystem physiology has been this idea that plant growth is not necessarily just driven by the production of carbon. It's not necessarily just driven by how much carbon leaves can assimilate. It's also limited by how much carbon they can use, right? So it's not just the source which is controlling it, it's also the sink of carbon. And what I mean by that is this idea that abiotic conditions, temperature and moisture, directly influence how fast cells can expand, right? So what this shows is that this is photosynthesis against temperature, this is photosynthesis, and this is growth rate. So a thing that's very consistent in these observations is that below 5 degrees Celsius, plants don't grow any new tissue, right? They can't deploy that carbon into new tissue. So if it's never above 5 degrees Celsius, we can, it's very hard to make any new tissue for most plants. So I decided I would add a very simplistic version of this this idea, which has been sort of pushed very hard in the literature recently, into the CLM. And so I just decided that I would introduce this simple hypothesis that below 5 Celsius, carbon is diverted into storage and growth is paused. So we don't make any more leaves, roots, or stems. We just put the carbon into our store for later bank account, right? And so what we find is that this is the control model I showed you before, right? And this is the new model with growth limitation. And it's quite hard to tell the difference, right? They didn't have an enormous impact, but it did have some impact. This is the delta between those two. And so you can see that in all these cold areas, we get less biomass growth in these areas which are limited in their growth expansion than we did before. And this is the stored biomass, so we're finding that the stored carbon is diverted instead into the reserves the plant has because it's assimilated them, but it can't use them because it's too cold. So it's going to have a moderate success in dropping the tree line, maybe a couple of degrees, but it requires more in the way of experiments. And like I said, this is the very first set of simulations we've done with our new model, so it's quite exciting that we can use it to investigate these different hypotheses. So to summarise that first, the bulk of the talk, so Earth observation data, I use them in 3 ways to test hypotheses in the CLM-Ed model. The optimization hypothesis was successful at improving LAI. Implementing the cell expansion limitation had limited success in constraining the tree line to its observed limit, but it had some success. And changing the water use efficiency, which was another hypothesis I had no success at all in improving evapotranspiration. So this is interesting because this means that the proliferation of these new Earth observation products, newer and older observation products, means that it's quite difficult for a model to get them all right all at the same time. We're approaching a state where sort of constraining the model to get GPP, evapotranspiration, leaf area index, biomass, canopy height, etc., is actually quite difficult. And those things should, in time, sort of constrain us towards a more consistent prediction of future carbon exchange with the atmosphere. So, on that note, I'm going to talk about some new, really exciting things that are coming out of the Earth observation community, sort of driven by this question, which we'll be able to use, and some people are using at the moment. So the first one is a very recent paper from 2014, and these are early results from the GOSAT mission, which is observing atmospheric CO2. And what you have here is this is demonstration that GOSAT works okay, right? So this is sort of airplane measurements of CO2 in the black dots, and GOSAT observations in grey. So the GOSAT satellite is with its I'm not going to pretend to understand this thermal and near-infrared sensor for carbon observation Fourier transform spectrometer. That's what it uses. And so we can use this data to sort of assimilate. Sorry, we can assimilate this data into our land surface models. And what these people have done is this is the mean of 8 different land surface models that they have run simultaneously to predict photosynthesis. And this is what happens to those model predictions when you assimilate the data from the satellite. So we're sort of getting a more nuanced, more structured prediction of GPP out of that. So this is possibly a new kind of product that we can use to constrain our new model simulations. Another really exciting thing that happened last year was that the European Space Agency funded a mission called Biomass, which does what it says. It will measure, I think it's going up by 2020, it will be measuring biomass without the need for the calibration process that I described earlier, using this active P-band synthetic aperture radar. This is an illustration that this P-band radar system does kind of something sensible biomass there. Doesn't saturate, which is interesting, it's exciting. And this is from the Biomass mission's propaganda page. So we're looking forward to having sort of global time-varying estimates of biomass that don't depend on field observations of leaves, of roots, etc. In the future. Another slightly more puzzling satellite product is microwave backscatter. So this piece of data cropped up in the literature a few times in the last year or so. And this is the microwave backscatter observations from the 2010 drought in Amazonia. And what it shows is that the microwave backscatter, which passes over twice a day, it shows that in the afternoon passover, the system, so microwave backscatter is a estimate of the total water that the satellite can see in the system. So if it can see the soil, it's the soil. If it can see the leaves, it's the leaves, right? And so it's an estimate of that. And we see this very strong structure in the 2005 drought in southwest Amazonia. Except that we don't really know what to compare this to in a model. It just says something about the water structure of the system went down in the drought, and this is what happened. But hopefully someone will do some sort of ground calibration of what this means, and we'll be able to integrate it into our models of water stress.
Rosie, what was the difference between those two?
It is the what is it? I think this might be the error. I was really hoping no one would ask that. I was thinking, I don't know what that is. Anyway, right. So the most exciting, probably the most exciting piece of the remote sensing puzzle is hyperspectral remote sensing, which currently is an airborne system, mostly driven by Greg Asner's group at the Carnegie Airborne Observatory, but they're also NEON are beginning to operate this kind of system as well. The deal with hyperspectral remote sensing is that we measure 5 nanometer resolution all the way from 380 to 2510 wave bands. And this means we have this extremely data-rich representation of the land surface, which here is calibrated with, it's twinned with a LiDAR estimate of canopy structure. So what we can get from that is this really useful way of representing either tree species or canopy properties. But what this kind of depends on, it kind of opens up this whole new field of having to go. People can go into the field and they can measure the spectral properties of individual leaves, or they can measure the spectral properties of different species. This is a map of various different species in Central Africa, and they can say this kind of spectral reflectance corresponds to Mapani trees, or this kind of spectral reflectance corresponds to leaves with lots of phosphorus, etc. And so we'll, in the fullness of time, once people have gone out and found out those pieces of information about the world, we'll be able to construct some kind of meaning for this sort of colour image of the different spectral bands here. So people are pushing to get a hyperspectral satellite into orbit. The JPL people at NASA are trying to arrange this to happen. I'm not really up on when this may or may not happen, but it's really exciting when it does. And so that's the end of my talk. I just thought I'd leave you with the beautiful canopy height map just to gaze at in the questions. Thank you. Questions, Joni? Do you have to speak into the thing?
Yeah, sorry. If you want to get up. I'm record.
So I hope this is not a stupid question, but I was wondering if there's a important grazing component anywhere in terms of trying to balance your biomass.
Important what component?
Yeah, grazing component.
Grazing component.
because I mean, I know like in the tropics and the rainforest, there's a huge turnover rate just due to grazing by insects. And I was wondering if that could be a component of where your possible mismatch between the...
That is a good question, which has several answers. The first answer is that no, we don't explicitly have grazing in the moment in the model. At the moment, the leaf lifespan is a parameter, and leaf lifespan is smaller. So leaf lifespan is shorter for leaves that are made in a more flimsy way, so they have like lower nitrogen and leaf biomass per unit area. And so what that implies empirically in the model is they live for less time. So it's kind of like, it's one of those things that we don't understand about the world, and so we just empiricize. We go out and measure leaf lifespan versus leaf mass and say, well, there's a relationship there, we'll use that. But what that really means is that if you make your leaf in a flimsy way, it'll be eaten by an insect quicker than if you make it in like a ponderosa pine tree does. Second part of the answer is that there's a kind of a push in the insect in the insect tree mortality research literature to have defoliating insects specifically represented in climate models, because they can have big impact on whole ecosystems. You know, I've just mentioned the Mapani tree is famous for this, right? And in Africa, Mapani worms can decimate whole forests in like a couple of days. So, but of course, modelling insect dynamics adds this whole layer of extra terrifying complexity on top of just trying to model plant dynamics, which we haven't arguably really nailed down yet. So, yeah, good question.
It seems like with the changes that you've made to the model that the disturbance history is a big player, or should be a big player in there. So how is that represented in the model? I mean, is it a stochastic process that you put in? Is it based off some other factors in the model, parameterized?
So there's three disturbance types, I guess, two of which are active, one of them not. So we have stress mortality from drought, which is like a carbon starvation function. And then we have fire mortality, which comes out of the Spitfire model, so that's prognostic. What we haven't implemented yet is the land use harvest part of the CLM. So we have all this code in the CLM which generates, I guess, transitions between different land use types. So we go from like managed land to set-aside land and natural land, crops, etc. So that part remains unaccomplished. But yeah, it's definitely like top of the list of things to do.
I have a couple of questions. First is, it's related to the land use question. If you're using Earth observations, the land use change is there. So you'll be taking that out somehow. Yeah, you'll have to make it, to see if your model's working, or only select places where there's no land use change. Yeah, so in the CLM, we I said at the beginning, we have a natural vegetation part of the land surface and a managed vegetation part of the land surface. So the managed vegetation part of the land surface is at the moment dealt with by the old physiology model. So that kind of thing should be, in theory, sort of active. So it should match the observations. In theory. In the kind of, in theory, at least it should do. So we kind of try our best to. You can ask Peter more about this, who sat next to you. we try our best to use the data products which are given to us by the group at George Hurt's group, which make the IPCC standard land use transition drivers. So we all climate models try and use the same land use transition data to predict, to sort of represent the historical. And then that would be part of the cell, and then it would somehow get averaged with whatever you're predicting for your new part. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I should talk to you offline about that some more. But the other thing is this. So you didn't mention using glass data. No. Which is pretty neat. It's not just height. People have transformed it into biomass. Yeah. So I mean, you can. So biomass and height, I kind of, they're slightly interdependent, both in the model and in the data products. Yeah. So, are you going to use this as well as one of your validation? Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's part. The thing is, it's partly validating your physiology model using this data, but it's also partly validating your allocation between your allometry between biomass and height. So if you only have a sort of single allometry between biomass and height, then you're partly just testing the validity of that, rather than testing the validity of the whole ecosystem physiology. But at the same time, if you use a biomass product, then you're kind of trusting their
height, but because they're looking
Yeah.
at height products as well and translating those into biomass. So you
Or
at some
LAI
point,
to biomass.
you're dependent on
Yeah.
somebody's assumptions of what the allometric relationship between biomass and height is. Ideally, you should try very hard to use the same allometrics, but if you disagree on what they should be, then it's more tricky. So kind of worms.
I have a question regarding observations. You mentioned, you showed visible IR measurements, NDVIs and LAIs. Then you showed some of the microwave measurements using a SAR, like a P-band SAR, which is kind of 2020. So wondering, both assets plus and minus, how you look at it, deeper penetration, look at only the canopy height with the visible IR. So many SARs already exist. Like L-band, P-band SARs already in orbit for many, many years. I was wondering, what is special about 2020 P-band SAR you mentioned about it? Because SAR is just a radar measurements of backscatter. That's all it is.
So some SAR products, there's ALOS PAL-SAR, which is a product that already exists from a Japanese satellite. And people have used that to look at biomass predictions. I think it's just, I don't know exactly why, but I think the calibration, the setup of the sensor in the ALOS PAL-SAR, which is ALOS PAL-SAR is the best we have now, right? So the setup of that sensor doesn't produce the same fidelity as this new P-band sensor, specifically for predicting biomass when people have done ground calibrations. I don't know why that is, because it's not my field, but they seem pretty set on this specific P-band. So it's probably the answer to that question is probably on the Biomass mission website at the European Space Agency. So there you go.
Well, I should probably let you go.
Cool.
So,
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie,
Thanks
again.
for listening.